So hello, everyone. My name is Sean Han, and I'll be the moderator of today's event. I'm the Associate Director of the Chosun History Society, and I'll be the moderator of today's talk. We are excited to have John Grisafi as our invited speaker in today's Zoom session. And I'm really glad to see new friends, old friends, and colleagues from various places joining in today's Zoom event. Chosun History Society has been hosting Zoom events with participation of scholars from Korea, United States, and Europe. And Chosun History Society is a public learned society fostering an active community of researchers and learners of Korea's past by connecting scholars working both inside and outside of the professional academia across disciplines. If you are interested in giving a talk, please reach out to us. You can go to our website where you can find the submission page to submit your request. And we are also inviting members who will be willing to join our Chosun History Society team and work with us. So before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to first introduce our Chosun History Society's new project called the Translation and Consultation Network, a new project that our society launched recently. So the Translation and Consultation Network aims to help Korean studies scholars find fruitful collaborative relationship. And the purpose of this network is to connect scholars to ongoing projects and help them find research, translation, and editorial services. We have specialists who are now listed in our Chosun History Society website. All those people are all vetted academic qualifications, experienced people, especially in the field of Korean studies. So those with academic expertise in Korean studies, if you're interested in providing editorial or translation or academic consultation service, they're all encouraged to submit their profiles to the Chosun History Society. And you can find the submission template also from our website. You will be also required to sign a user agreement and academic conduct to be part of this. And based on that information, our society will list your profile on the CHS website, and those web page will specify your areas of expertise and services. The Chosun History Society will not be responsible for setting up any rates or prices of specific service, and we will leave such conversation to the interested parties. Again, Chosun History Society gains no money, and all the rates and price decisions are determined by the interested party in those conversations. So please join and spread the word. So without further ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker, John, and we will start. John G. Grisafi is a PhD candidate in religious studies at Yale University. His interests are in Asian religions and philosophies, religious and secular modernity, and Korean history, with a research emphasis on discursive construction of religion and its impact on society, politics, and epistemology. John's dissertation project is on the legal and discursive construction of religion in Korea under the Japanese colonial rule and the US and Soviet military occupation period. His other scholarship includes a study of the impact of early pandemic discourse around Shincheonji, a new religion in Korea, and its relation with COVID-19 in South Korea, which was published in Nova Religio in 2021. John has previously earned BA and MA in East Asian languages and civilizations from the University of Pennsylvania. So the title of today's talk is Constructing Religion in Korea, under the Japanese and American rule. So without further ado, please welcome John Grisafi.
All right, can everyone see the slides and hear me? Yep, okay. So thank you, Sean, for that introduction. Thank you to the Joseon History Society for hosting this talk. And thank you, everyone in the audience, for attending tonight or this morning, wherever you may be. My presentation today is based on my ongoing dissertation project. It's a work in progress in a relatively early stage, so please bear with me in my attempts to work through ideas in some respects more thoroughly researched and developed than in others. The tentative structure of my dissertation will, of course, have an introduction and conclusion, and I'm planning 4 content chapters. First 2 will be on the period of Japanese colonial rule and their governmental construction of religion, as well as Korean discourse relevant to and in response to the same. Haven't yet decided to break them up chronologically or thematically. The third chapter, of which I've already written a draft, is on the 1945 to 48 US military occupation of South Korea and their construction of religion. And the fourth is on the contemporaneous Soviet occupation of the North. Today, I'll be covering some introduction materials, some content I am planning for chapters 1 and 2, much more from chapter 3, that being written, nothing right now from 4, some concluding remarks. I want to begin by looking at this map. This was in the sort of preview materials, so you should recognize that. This is a religious distribution map, or Shukyo Buntozu, of Korea, produced in 1927 by the Japanese government general, the colonial authority in Korea. It uses bar graphs to indicate the membership by province in 4 religions: Shinto, Buddhism, Korean Buddhism, and Christianity. This map is revealing and interesting because of what it does and does not depict. Why these 4 religions with these labels? Why, in Korea of all places, distinguish Korean Buddhism from Buddhism? And what then does Buddhism mean here? Why not distinguish between different types of Christianity? Where are the other religions like shamanism, new religious movements, even Confucianism? Maps and other depictions of human measured statistics of human activity like this one often do reveal only some of the picture, and in so doing reveal as much about who generated that information as about the phenomenon being measured. It's no accident that these 4 religions are shown with these labels and no others. These are the 4 religions the Japanese government general in Korea officially recognized. All other traditions and practices were considered something other than religion. And they're not on this map at all, not subsumed in some other category you see here. They're just not counted. The division of Buddhism on the map reflects an administrative and forcible separation by the government general of Korean Buddhism from Japanese Buddhism that began in 1911. And Buddhism here just refers to Japanese Buddhism. And despite Shinto being on this map, what most of us think of as when we hear Shinto today, the shrines with the kami and the red torii, that's not on this map at all. Shinto here is what was called sectarian or religious Shinto, and it's something a bit different than what we all generally think of as Shinto today. That's not on the map because they didn't consider it officially to be a religion. This map is therefore a window into the complexities of identifying and categorizing religion in Korea under Japanese rule. Moving to the present day, we might be inclined to think the statistics and their depictions are more accurate and objective. Now, both of these pie charts are based on the same 2015 census data from the South Korean government, but they look quite different. The biggest difference is Britannica's, on the bottom left, shows religious affiliations, including the claim of no affiliation, as percentage of the total population, while the other from a peer-reviewed article in the journal Religions shows these numbers as a percentage of those who claim some affiliation. And these numbers more or less add up, but we can also see that the upper right gets into more detail, showing religions such as Confucianism, chonggyo, and Won Buddhism that are not explicit on the other one. The data is limited in reflecting what the Korean government allowed it to show through the questions they asked and the answers they accepted and put into the statistics. Respondents could select Buddhism, Catholicism, Protestantism, Won Buddhism, Confucianism, Chonggyo, Daeson Jirihei, Daejongyo, as well as other or no religion. But specific denominations of Protestantism and Buddhism, putting aside Won Buddhism as a separate category, don't show up in the data in any way. Shamanism is completely absent, which is kind of aligns with the fact that few people, if any, aside from shamans themselves, would identify that as their religious affiliation. But that only speaks to a deeper complexity of measuring religiosity. It can be more complex than saying, this is my religion. And that impacts Confucianism. Very many Koreans engage in Confucian practices, and admittedly so, but decline to identify that as their religious affiliation. So it just doesn't, it's not that it doesn't show up in here, it does, but not very much. My point here is not that the South Korean government or the Japanese colonial government measured religion incorrectly. My point is that identifying, categorizing, and measuring religion is very, very subjective. What even is religion? And how do we know? And what does that matter? My own answer to this takes a constructivist approach, that religion is what people say is religion. In other words, it's a human construct. It's inherently shaped by human thoughts, language, and actions. And rarely do humans all agree on such subjective things. So that's where this gets interesting. While many scholars have influenced this critical theory approach that I take, two particularly strong influences are Jonathan Z. Smith and Talal Assad. Inspired by Smith, I always like to call attention to the subjectivity of the terms religion, religions, and religious, and the problems that arise from their expanded usage beyond Europe and the Americas in particular. The terms are created for intellectual purposes and defined through intellectual discourse. They don't defy definition, they defy singular definition, being subject to change and debate. Assad similarly inspires my approach to the concepts of the secular, recognizing that different cultures, institutions, and people have different notions of what is properly secular and non-religious, informed by their own cultural and religious backgrounds and biases. What looks perfectly secular or non-religious and appropriate for the secular space to one person might appear very religious and inappropriate for the secular space to another person. And this definitely comes up in Korea and in my project. My project is also inspired by, and will hopefully be considered part of, a growing discourse on religion and empire. Such scholarship typically examines the complex relationships between empire and not just the practices and institutions of religion, but the very way we look at and think about religion, especially in places that were once or still part of these empires. Studies of religion and empire frequently build upon and reinforce the aforementioned critical and secularism theories, as empires and their colonies are precisely the frontiers where the concepts of religion and secular are being challenged as they're introduced and rapidly shaped in cultures and societies that either lack exact homologues for these terms or just think quite differently about them than do the hegemonic Christian cultures of Europe and the Americas. These are just a few examples of the works in this area of study that have inspired me, and Kwansu Kim is, of course, my advisor, and Tisa Wanger is also on my committee, so shout out to them and their inspiration on me. I know that for this audience, I hardly need to justify the importance of studying Korea. Nonetheless, it's worth addressing the question of why Korea is an excellent case for studying religion in this manner. Over thousands of years, Korea has seen various religions either develop indigenously or be introduced from abroad, with even those religions introduced developing and changing significantly in Korea. Korean culture and society has adopted and embraced diverse religious traditions and gone through long periods in which different religious or philosophical traditions have been the major influence. The result is a nation and culture which is hard to characterize with one religious tradition, and South Korea today being a country in which a variety of religions coexist, with none being a numerical majority. Adding to this significance is the relative newness of the word religion in Korea. The modern Korean word for religion, chonggyo, first appears with such usage in the 1880s, likely the result of a borrowing of the word shuko from Japanese, using the same Chinese characters, and itself only coined in the 1870s to approximate European language words for the same. Now, Korea is not unique in this regard, it being true in Japan as well as China and other places, but it's nonetheless true that the word chonggyo had to quickly take on meaning at a transformative time in Korean history during rapid modernization and reform and increasing foreign influence of religion in the realms of religion and politics. Indeed, the influence of foreign empire was already felt in Korea by the time the word chonggyo appears. In 1876, Korea signed the Ganghwa Treaty with Japan, first of its many unequal treaties, opening the country to Japanese settlement and influence. Along with Japanese settlers comes Japanese religion, such as Shinto and Japanese Buddhism. Of course, Korea already had Buddhism. Among the other unequal treaties Korea signed was the 1886 treaty with France, the first of Korea's treaties to specifically grant freedom of religion to foreign residents. And for those of you familiar with unequal treaties, they typically have a most favored nation clause, which means what's in one treaty can be used by the people who are affected by the other treaties. This was helpful for American Protestant missionaries. In 1905, Japan established protectorate status over Korea, taking charge of diplomatic affairs and exerting even more political influence, including on religion. And the annexation by Japan in 1910 began 35 years of direct colonial rule, during which time religion was even more actively regulated and shaped by that colonial government. Even after Korea was nominally liberated in 1945, the peninsula was divided and governed by military occupation forces of the United States in the south and the Soviet Union in the north, bringing with them their own ideas about religion and secular, contextualized in the politics of the early Cold War. What all of this means is that the earliest decades of the word chonggyo, when the concept was taking shape initially, happened under the influence and rule of foreign empire. The Japanese colonial authorities enacted and implemented quite a number of laws and regulations impacting religion in Korea. I'm not going to go over them all in detail, and this is an incomplete list, but it's just to demonstrate the repeated formal involvement of the government to actively shape religion in this period. You can see it actually starts in the protectorate period, 1906. So, yeah. The various Japanese laws and regulations can be understood as effectively creating three major categories related to religion: officially recognized religion, pseudo-religion, and non-religion. The various laws and regulations mentioned, as well as decisions about enforcing them and other rhetoric, gave shape to these categories. This imperial Japanese framework for religion, which was used elsewhere in the empire, not only in Korea, is not coincidentally a formal example of implementing the trinary model of religion, secular, and superstition that Jason Josephson Storm describes in his book, The Invention of Religion in Japan. The category of officially recognized religion, chonggyo or koninko, was shaped largely by the 1915 regulations on religious propagation, which define which ones are religions that can propagate. Within this category were 4 religions: sectarian Shinto, Christianity, Buddhism, and Korean Buddhism. Officially recognized religions were managed by the Government General's Department of Religion. By distinguishing between Buddhism and Korean Buddhism, the latter of which was just a single order, essentially what's now the Jogye order, but Buddhism in general was various Japanese sects. The Government General recognized a 4th religion that did not formally exist in Japan, where they only had 3. Owing to the Government General's desires to keep Korean Buddhism from merging into Japanese Buddhism, and so they can more tightly control it themselves, rather than it getting lost into the Japanese sects. And without going into too much detail, sectarian Shinto consisted of several religious movements with Shinto inspirations that most of us today wouldn't think of when we think of Shinto. This includes such movements as the quite successful Tenrikyo. They weren't part of the official system of Shinto shrines with the mandatory attendance, which I'll get to later. The pseudo-religions category was effectively a means for the Government General to acknowledge that some traditions were similar to religion, yet still declined to officially recognize them as religion. Instead of being managed by the Department of Religion, pseudo-religions were under the purview of the police, and thus the legality of their existence was always somewhat tenuous, subject to inspections, raids, and closures at government discretion. Included in this category were a wide variety of groups with lineages from Donghak and Jungsando, as well as groups coming from shamanism, but also unrecognized groups from otherwise recognized religions like Buddhism or non-religions like Confucianism. The existence of this category is significant as it's a formalization of that 3rd category from the trinary model that inevitably merges in discourses about religion and non-religion, the one to which so-called superstitions and cults are relegated. The inclusion of new religious movements, such as those of Donghak lineage, is quite typical of this kind of category. But the inclusion of Buddhist and Confucian groups is also really interesting because it demonstrates that Japanese authorities weren't content to afford blanket recognition to those traditions, whether as religion or non-religion, and allow them to define themselves. Instead, they took an active role in drawing the boundaries of those traditions, deciding what exactly legitimately qualified as Buddhism or Confucianism. And while this formal category was abolished from the legal system after liberation, it persists in Korea today informally through the usage of such terms as Saibi Jongyo and Idan to label marginal religious groups and characterize them as illegitimate, which I covered in my 2021 Nova Religio article. Of course, this is true elsewhere too. It's not a uniquely Korean phenomenon. Non-religion is not an official category per se, but rather the leftover catch-all label that we can use to describe traditions and institutions legally treated as separate from the religion and pseudo-religion category. Such a category always emerges anytime you say this is religion and nothing else. Implicitly, something else is non-religion. The two most significant examples of this are shrine Shinto and Confucianism. And I'll go into great detail now about the issue of shrine Shinto, as that's a particularly pertinent one to the discourse and debate about religion and non-religion in colonial Korea. Now commonly known as state Shinto or national Shinto, what the Japanese authorities then called shrine Shinto was officially treated as a non-religion. Unlike sectarian Shinto, the Shrine Shinto network was officially sponsored by the state. These state-sponsored shrines were used heavily as part of a policy which came to be known as kominka, the transformation of colonial peoples in particular into imperial subjects. Participation in shrine rituals was expected to reinforce unity and identity as imperial subjects who would be loyal to the state and the emperor, thereby molding colonial people into the kinds of subjects the empire desired, especially during wartime. Beginning in 1925, school students and teachers were required to participate in these rituals, and teachers who refused were fired. This requirement was extended to other institutions, including Christian churches, in 1937. This is where the debate over Shrine Shinto's status as religious or secular intensified. Japanese authorities officially declared this form of Shinto as a civil act, an expression of identity, national identity, and patriotism. Some Christian denominations accepted this definition, such as the Methodists and the Catholic Church. Catholic compliance related quite closely to a decision by the Vatican that pertained more to a debate that had been taking place for over 2 centuries in East Asia, the question of whether Confucian-style ancestral rites conflicted with Catholic doctrine. And in 1939, Pope Pius XII formally declared those Confucian-style rites to be civil and not religious. And this seems to have been the basis for making a similar interpretation of Shrine Shinto. Frankly, they also probably just wanted to avoid the kinds of headaches that they had dealt with for 200 years. The Presbyterian churches, however, were contentiously divided on this issue. Some Presbyterians were very opposed to participation in shrine rites and to the interpretation of them as secular, while others were willing to accept it, though sometimes only as a pragmatic approach, so they could be allowed to continue their own practice and avoid being shut down. This became a controversial issue within the churches and seminaries. And when the Japanese government general and colonial police pressured and intimidated the Presbyterian General Assembly in 1938 to vote in favor of accepting this position that Shrine Shinto was non-religious, some Presbyterians still resisted. Some of them, as well as other Christians, left their churches and started unofficial, unregistered, like house churches, or just worshipped individually to sort of escape scrutiny. Although then they risked running afoul of the police. It is telling that the debate over Shrine Shinto's status became most heated with Christians. A major sticking point for the Christians was while that such rituals were labeled non-religious, it was fairly explicit that kami, the Japanese word for spirits or deities or gods, were enshrined at these sites, and that you're revering the imperial family here. And it was explicit that the imperial family was descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu, and the emperor and his line were divine. For many Christians, this felt like a violation of their first commandment to recognize and worship no god but their own, and therefore mandatory participation a violation of their religious freedom. So in this sense, it was their theological doctrine of their religion and how they defined themselves as Christians that made it impossible to see Shrine Shinto as anything but religious. In other words, their own religion defined what else was religious or secular. But Christians weren't the only ones objecting to Shrine Shinto being coded as non-religious. In fact, the next most vocal group were Shinto intellectuals, priests and scholars, some of whom felt that the state's usage of Shinto in this way was improper and disrespectful to the tradition and its willing as well as unwilling participants. So imagine someone taking your religion and say, hey, we're going to control this and say it's not a religion anymore. You might have a problem with that. What we see relatively little of is protest coming from a specifically Confucian or Buddhist standpoint, at least on the religion secular question. This is likely because for a Confucian standpoint, these don't really seem all that different from what they're already doing. Just, it's directed toward Japan and toward the state, or a different state of the empire. And for Buddhists, it's less of an important question, and it doesn't violate any Buddhist principles to recognize additional deities, or any deities if they weren't inclined to begin with, or to participate in non-Buddhist rituals. In fact, Buddhists in Japan had been accepting Shinto kami for a very, very long time. This is nothing new at all. And a Buddhist might be more inclined to say, I'm not going to get hung up on this ritual because of over-attachment to an idea and just let it go. And I'm not saying this to say the Buddhists and the Confucians were collaborating or not trying hard enough, or conversely to say the Christians cared too much, but just demonstrating here that different religious backgrounds color understandings of what belongs in the religious and secular realms and the very definition of religion. Following Japanese surrender in August 1945, Korea was divided at the 38th parallel and placed under military occupation governance by the United States in the South. That map should actually be different. Per U.S. military doctrine, the U.S. military government established parallel offices to its predecessor, and so included a religion section or division under its Bureau of Education. Doctrine also required the military government to retain most laws, but they were allowed to repeal those deemed to conflict with their aims or best interests. So that gets interesting. They did repeal some laws impacting religion, such as the shrine and temple regulations and the peace preservation law. But they left some intact, notably the temple ordinance, which gave government control over Buddhist temples, or Korean Buddhist temples specifically. Additionally, the bulk of information the military government had on Korean religion was acquired from Japanese sources, government sources mostly, and so reflected Japanese approaches to recognizing and categorizing religion. This inherited legacy played a role in the development of US policy on Korean religion. Military and civilian occupation officials responsible for religion in Korea developed policies in line with principles of religious freedom and the goal of eliminating Japanese ultranationalistic and militaristic ideas. William Kerr, a civilian and former missionary attached to the occupation's higher headquarters in Tokyo, told his supervisor that the general attitude of the religion section in Seoul was that just as little as possible should be done to interfere with the activities of the religious bodies, and any appearance of desiring to control them should be avoided. His supervisor, Lieutenant William Bunce, head of the religions division in Tokyo, again, the higher occupation headquarters, concurred that the ideal policy was one of benevolent neutrality, as near to non-interference as religious freedom and equality for all permits. The sincerity of their desires notwithstanding, such a policy proved far easier said than done. This desired non-interference policy toward religion is in fact restricted by logic. In order for a military government or any government to say they're not going to interfere in religion, they have to first decide what does and does not count as religion. And thereby they've already failed to not interfere. The fact that the US military government had a religions branch further necessitated decisions on what problems that branch would address and how they would do so. One such problem was the Shinto dilemma. US wartime rhetoric criticized Imperial Japan for granting Shinto the status of a mandatory state religion. The US occupation was tasked with eliminating vestiges of Japanese ultranationalism and militarism, of which they saw state Shinto, which is what they called it, as part. On the other hand, they're required to protect religion, which they had called it a state religion, so they said it was a religion. To solve this dilemma, the US military government in Seoul turned to the very Japanese policy that American rhetoric had largely rejected, the claim that state Shinto was not a religion. So, directly contradicting policy being formulated by their superiors at the same time in Tokyo and Washington, the US military government in Seoul officially ruled that state Shinto was not a religion, and thus the shrines could legally be removed from Korea, while they simultaneously declared that so-called sectarian Shinto was a religion deserving religious freedom protections, thus reusing the exact categorical distinction the Japanese colonial government had created in the first place. Oh, yeah, sorry. I always forget that little animation is there. Another issue was over the Buddhist temple properties. The US military government was unwilling to turn over the large amount of Japanese Buddhist temple property to the Korean Buddhist order, what we now call the Jogye order, presumably because they thought it would make them way too influential. And as a result, they not only embraced the separation between Korean and Japanese Buddhism the colonial government had created, but they even struck down a law that would have repealed the temple ordinance, thus retaining the Japanese system of government control of Buddhist temple affairs, enabling their continued separation of these. And that remained in effect until the 1960s, so after Syngman Rhee. In these cases and others, the US military government made decisions to actively shape the category of religion and the boundaries within and between religions in ways that suited their own political objectives, sometimes reifying Japanese policy in the process, despite claiming to be the opposite of. Their policy fell short of neutrality and non-interference for other reasons, though. In one of his letters on formulating religions policy for Korea, Lieutenant Bunce observed there might be reason to give a mild sponsorship to Christianity. And indeed, they did have a close relationship with Christianity, particularly Protestantism, which gave that religion a distinct advantage and amounted to a form of mild sponsorship, as he called it. The relationship preceded the start of the occupation, as Protestant missionaries and their children, after decades of living and working in Korea, were among the few Americans with any knowledge of the country, the people, the language, which made them an indispensable resource for the US government and military, first during the war, where they advised the military and government, and then afterward, when they and their children, so-called Mish kids, became military and civilian officials within the occupation forces in Korea and Japan. And their affiliation and experience undoubtedly influenced their perspectives. Many military chaplains assigned to US forces in Korea had also been missionaries, and chaplains were permitted, at the insistence of General Douglas MacArthur, to propagate Christianity to the Korean public instead of providing services only to the US military, which is usually what chaplains do. Chaplains and other officials also facilitated a working relationship with active missionaries and helped to open Korea to the return of Protestant missionaries as early as June 1946, allowing them to re-enter the country far in advance of any other non-occupation personnel. Once in Korea, missionaries were granted special access to temporary housing, medical services, food and other provisions, and transportation by the US military. While the stated reason for this was that availability of such resources was severely limited on the Korean economy, such an acknowledgement makes quite clear that the US military government knowingly gave Protestant missionaries advantages not enjoyed by any other religious organization. This early return of and support for missionaries was favored heavily by MacArthur, commander of US forces in the Pacific region at the time, and General John R. Hodge, commander of the US Army military government in Korea, who both saw Christianity as a means to uplift the backward people and instill American values like democracy and freedom, as well as form a strong bulwark against the spread of communism. These generals and many Korean and non-Korean Christians in and out of the occupation force were concerned over potential communist presence in the South, the spread of communist ideas, and reports of communist crackdowns on religion in North Korea. In line with increasingly popular thought as part of the religious Cold War, such individuals believed Christianity and communism were in direct opposition in an existential struggle. Essentially, the idea that you could be Christian or you could be communist, not both. So if you're made one first, you won't be the other. Thus, whereas the Japanese government had officially proclaimed Shinto its national ideology to foment loyalty and patriotism, and directly sponsored shrines, the US military government gave de facto mild sponsorship to Christianity, promoting it as the religion, which they called it a religion, best suited to minimize the spread of communism and generally inculcate the kind of values they wanted in Koreans, while granting indirect sponsorship to churches by providing missionaries with substantial material support. While the Japanese government had been explicit about defining and shaping religion, the US occupation forces declared a non-interference policy, but were quite active in shaping and defining religion in their own way. This is not to condemn US religion's policy in Korea, saying it was dishonest or only superficially different, nor is my intent to say, well, we should then ignore the deliberate policies of the Japanese regime aimed at shaping and restricting, in some cases, oppressing religion. Quite the opposite. You should pay close attention to this. My point is that all governments and institutions and individuals have opinions on religion and have agency toward it, and exercise this whether they think they're doing so or not. Both the Japanese and American regimes impacted religion in ways that shaped modern Korean religion with lasting effects. So, whether explicit about desires to shape religion or proclaiming non-interference, it's impossible for any state or institution to deal with religion and be completely neutral toward it. Religion and its associated concepts are subjective human constructs. And so we should be aware that human thought, language, and action never merely describe or conform to some natural truth about religion, but instead actively create the realities of religion. That concludes my prepared remarks. I look forward to some helpful feedback to make this dissertation better than what I have now.
Well, thank you very much, John, for your fascinating talk about how the post-colonial government and the US military government played a significant role in terms of leaving a long-lasting, impactful legacy of the relation between religion and society in Korea. Thank you again for sharing your work with us. So now we will have about 30 minutes question and answer time. So if you have questions, you can raise those questions two ways. You can use the raise hand function on the Zoom meeting to let me know that you want to take the chance to address question, feedback, comments. I will call out your name and then you can unmute yourself and raise question. You can also leave those questions in text form in the chat box. So in the chat box, you can type down your question. I will organize them in the order I received and have John to answer those questions accordingly. I will read out loud those questions to everyone first, and then John will answer. And you can also make those questions anonymously by sending those questions directly to me so that I can just announce those questions without indicating your name. That's also fine. It's up to you. So, so we are open to floor. The floor is open. So if you have questions. So John, I have a question about how we understand religion as a subjective concept. So what we have heard a lot in this talk is how government authorities are playing a huge role in terms of defining what religion is. And there were also occasions that how people from the bottom who are identifying themselves as people who have their voice in this matter are also kind of disputing what state is demanding them to accept as a religion, like the case of the resistance by the Presbyterian church members about the different definition of state Shinto. So there is a kind of top to bottom and bottom of kind of interactions here, and especially in the late colonial period. I wonder if you had a case of seeing those similar kind of interactions of how state definitions faces response or reaction from the society, especially in the American occupation period.
So you're asking for other examples in other periods outside of the Shinto thing, or?
Yes. So yeah, any other examples about the bottom to top approaches or reaction, resistance to state definition?
I mean, as I said, I'm still in the early phases of this. So as far as earlier stuff in the Japanese colonial period or about other religions, I'm sure there are. In fact, I'm going back over my advisor Huan Su's work on the Buddhism side and trying to find more examples of this. We definitely see some of this going on to a lesser extent in the American occupation period, in that some Christian, mostly what I see is a lot of Christian discourse. That's because the Christians tended to be the most able to communicate with the Americans, which that's a whole nother, that language barrier and the sort of institutional and personal network connections creates another sort of bias. The Americans were only really talking to the Christians for the most part. They seemed clearly less concerned with what the Buddhists wanted. There was pushback on the issue of basically maintaining that separation of Korean Buddhism from Japanese Buddhism, not only within the what once again called the Jogye order, but also from within the essentially almost powerless Korean government, because there was like this interim assembly at the time that of like Korean, like the predecessor to the Gukwe, the National Assembly that existed under American rule. They could pass a law and the government general could say, nope. And that's exactly what happened. They tried to push through this, like, let's abolish the temple ordinance. Why are we keeping the temple ordinance? And the Americans said, no, because they have their own interests. And it's really fascinating. There were certainly different opinions coming around, not only from Koreans, but also from Americans in the time of the occupation. Some lower level officials and even chaplains were pretty insistent they should get rid of the religions division in the occupation force, that it was just a vestige of Japanese rule and that it would create precisely the problem that I'm saying happened. And they just didn't do it. It's like, and even when they tried to sort things out, they initially, one of the plans that never really fully got implemented was to basically put Christianity in all forms under purview of the chaplain's office and put all other religion under purview of the religions department, which is also a weird sort of separation. Again, they're doing things quite similarly, but in their own different way than the Americans. So let me get to these questions popping up in the chat now. I'll come back to you if that's okay. If you're
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't mind, yeah, I think that's a great answer. I can read out loud the questions that are in the chat box. So let's see. So first, go with Don Baker's question, and then move on to Dominic's Roblowski. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm really bad at reading non-English names, so
okay.
please bear with me.
Okay. It's
So,
okay.
yeah.
It's okay.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, I'll ask your name after asking questions from Don Baker. So Don Baker's question is, how did the Japanese distinguish between Korean pseudo-religions and sectarian Shinto? Was it only the fact that one group was Korean in origin and the other group was Japanese in origin? Or did they try to come up with a less discriminatory criteria?
That is a fantastic question. I expect no less on religion from Todd Baker. The short answer is I'm not entirely sure of the answer to this yet because I'm still working through these sources. And I do think that there's certainly a level of discrimination. You see far fewer Japanese origin groups put specifically in the Japanese documents of what is pseudo religion. What do they call it? Riji Shukyo or Yusajongyo in Korean. But there were some, and sometimes it was a matter of whether or not you were properly affiliated with recognized sects of sectarian Shinto. At different times, there were different numbers. I think at one point it was like 11 and then it was 13. Although I could be mixing that up with the number of Buddhist sects. If I'm not looking at it, I'm never really sure which number is which. A good example, though, was like Omotokyo in Japan, which had branches out in Korea, tried to align with some sect, didn't really properly do so and get accepted as such, and got raided by the police. Their buildings were smashed to the point that they were unrecoverable. And chonggyo in Korea had quite similar problems where they weren't accepted as aligned with anything despite attempts. I do think, though, that discrimination along sort of racial and origin lines definitely is a factor. And I think that if a Korean religion tried to set out as more particularly Korean, nationalistic in origin, they would run afoul of either some existing law on specific to religion, or, and this is the reason I included it, the peace preservation law. The peace preservation law was very explicit about anything that challenged the concept of the kokutai was illegal. The idea of the national body, as well as anything that challenged the concept of private property, which that was an anti-communism thing. But they frequently would use the peace preservation law to crack down on these kind of small religious groups, especially if they were either espousing ideas that were considered to Korean nationalists or collaborating or was working with people that were, undesirable political figures. So if you're too overly Korean, you're more likely to have a problem.
So thank you for that answer. And Dominic, I would like to read out your question. But before that, could you please tell us how to pronounce your full name correctly? Yeah.
My name, Dominik Wróblewski.
Dominic Wróblewski.
Yes, Polish
Thank
name.
you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for telling us your name, Dominic Wróblewski. I'm sorry. So let me read out your question. First, it was a good speech with many useful information. That was a comment. And the question is, did the Japanese use pseudo-religions to eliminate their Korean political and religious enemies?
That's a great question. I assume you mean, did they use the category and concept, not like the religions themselves? In which case,
it can be a concept or even the second category.
Yeah, I can't think of an example of how the second one would work. But actually, yes, no, I can. So both ways, kind of yes. They definitely, by putting these groups under the pseudo-religion category, which again, as I alluded to in answering the previous question, often had some sort of kind of Korean nationalistic or Korean origins, centrality of Korea in their theology and their doctrines, like some of the Donghak and other lineages, the lineage groups that we see. By putting this group in that category, it meant that the police could just manage them how they see fit, and they could crack down on them when they felt like it. They already had like a tenuous, like marginal status, and they weren't really recognized. So like there's a weird category of recognized but as unrecognized. Like it's like weird. But actually, interestingly, the second part is also true. And shout out to Albert Park's work for first turning me on to this. Part of the reason they didn't just shut these things down immediately, besides just practicality, was the Japanese authorities were afraid of probably one thing more than Korean nationalism, and that was communism and socialism. And they at one point did acknowledge that, well, some of these rural, like laboring people who might be inclined to be communist and socialist, we'd rather they belong to these kind of fringe religious groups if they're so inclined to do so, and if that fulfills them, than to be communist or socialist. So apparently they were buying into that Cold War religious mentality before the Cold War even began. This doesn't originate all of a sudden. This goes all the way back to, like, the beginnings of communism, Marxism, and all of that these things are in opposition. So they were doing something quite similar there. So again, it was kind of a pragmatic, like, as long as it doesn't get too far out of hand, we'd rather they be a religion we don't approve of than be communist. And in that sense, yeah, they're trying to stave off what they saw as a potentially greater threat, at least in the earlier periods of their rule of Korea. I guess even in the end of World War II, they were always really afraid of Soviet involvement. In fact, some historians will say that it wasn't the bombs that got Japan to surrender; it was the Soviets entering the war against them. Hard to know, but yeah, they were definitely worried about that.
Okay, thank you.
So the next question we have is from Joseph Seeley. So let me read out loud Joseph Seeley's question. Thanks for the great talk. I would like to hear a little more about your fourth dissertation chapter and what your finding has been about religion in North Korea under Soviet occupation. In line with this question, I have another question kind of relevant to this one in terms of how Soviet Russia treated religion, especially in ethnic minorities or countries under their influence, like the case of Muslim population in Central Asia. So I don't know if you had a kind of opportunity to look into those kind of works, if there is any kind of similarities that we can see in terms of kind of across the Soviet regimes in terms of religious policy and their commonalities or differences.
Could you repeat what your works you were referencing?
You mean the work that I'm referencing?
Or
No,
whatever.
No. I'm just
topic.
curious. I'm just curious about whether there is any work on Soviet Russia's policy on ethnic minorities in Central Asia, like Chechen. I'm just thinking about those groups. Yeah, in the Russian Federation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to be clear, I have not written any of this chapter yet, and it's sort of one of the more ambitious goals. We'll see what I find with sources. That said, I have done other research on how religion is narrativized historiographically and ideologically in North Korean school textbooks. And through that project, I did look at some backgrounds to how that understanding of religion arises, and looking at the Marxist, socialist, Leninist, Stalinist approach to religion. So to answer your question, Sean, that's some scholarship on that stuff exists, and I need to actually get deeper into it to inform my approach to North Korean religion. What I found so far, though, is that the North Korean approach to religion, especially uh, as it stems from this larger Soviet influence, tends to follow this idea that the future kind of realization of a socialist, communistic world, communist society anyway, also involves the inevitable secularization, by which they mean the eventual total absence of religion. This idea, this Marxist idea that religion is the opiate of the people, it is something of the past that was once useful and needs to be encouraged to shrink rather than be this sort of counter-revolutionary force. And North Korea very quickly starts out from 45 not being immediately openly aggressive toward religion, but kind of being quite subtle along following along the lines that, all right, we're not going to immediately like wipe out religion, and in fact they still haven't done so. Uh, but we're going to make sure it's extremely limited and has almost no influence. And what they did was cut off the funding of the churches. And they also basically forbid them from proselytizing in any way. Probably the best work available on this topic right now, other than little mentions here and there in books on North Korean history and history of Korean Christianity, is Sandra H. Park's article, A Reverend on Trial. So that gives you really good example of how they're sort of drawing bounds and defining limits for Christianity in particular. She also does a very good job of speaking to how that Talal Assad's work on secularism helps us understand that and how this fits into that idea of secularism being informed by our own cultural, political, religious backgrounds, and that our inclination is often to see a high tolerance for Christianity as normal in the secular space, but that's actually a quirk of heavily Christian influenced societies. Joseph, I wish I could answer more of your question right now, but again, early phases, I'm sure you know how difficult it is to get the sources. That's my next sort of research undertaking, is to dig into those sources, and fingers crossed I get what I need.
Thank you. And let me move on to the next question by Jin-Hyung So. So thank you for the great talk. If you look at Yale's dictionary from 1910s, you will notice that chonggyo, translated as national religion, not religion. Thus, might there be a link between these meanings of chonggyo and the general perception of religion in the late 19th century or early 20th century? Also, could we say that under the authority of the state government, Japan, US, and Korea, we can see a trend of altering the definition of chonggyo from national religion to general religion? I think this is a great question, thinking about how the concept itself has its own history of changing its meaning.
Yeah, absolutely. So I haven't gone over that source yet, and so thank you very, very much for flagging that for me. What I am familiar with is that, yeah, this pairing of characters, whether it's in Japan, Shukyo, Korea, Jongyo, China, Zonggyo, in its sort of recoinage at this time period, it did have an earlier, slightly different meaning in a Buddhist context. But it starts to take on a whole new meaning, and it's essentially a recoinage, starting with Japan at this time. And there's a lot of debate over what that even means. What does it mean to pair these two characters together to mean religion as opposed to something else? Because Chong is like variety, sect, like lineage, and Kyo is teaching. So some people immediately said, like, well, that doesn't really work for things like shamanism. Like, so that must not be a religion. Uh, the national religion idea is interesting because there were some ideas even sooner then 1910s, talking back in like the 1890s, like government officials like Shin Gi-sun wanted to say, well, okay, clearly Confucianism is our religion of our country. It should be embraced as such. And he was shot down. Uh, but clearly the Japanese went a different direction with this because they said our national ideology is not religion. It's something else. And they said religion is this other category. So they wouldn't have called it national religion. They didn't like that term. So maybe, I don't know how prevalent this idea was among Koreans or if it was just a dictionary. I do have a bunch of Korean writings now that I gathered just recently in Korea that I'm going over. So that will be me figuring out the answer to that kind of question. How did most Koreans, or at least I should say Korean intellectuals, we're not getting these kinds of writings from the general public, so to speak. I mean, I'll find what I can, but what's published, and survives from this time period is obviously going to skew toward reflecting more of the intellectual class than, say, the working class, or even some of the general, like, church going or the lay Buddhist population. But again, we'll see. It really interesting. And clearly the Americans also had a different idea. They want to separate national religion from general religion, but maybe there was a push for that. I look forward to finding the answer and hopefully providing it for you more clearly in the future.
Thank you.
So Dominic has left us valuable comments about possible source for the chapter on Soviet Russia's religion policy. So let me read this. During a conference in 2018 in Seongnam, I had a pleasure to talk with one professor from Russia. I'm also curious about this topic. I was informed that, there was works describing religions during the Soviet rule in North Korea, mostly in Russian language, and they are hardly available. There are also books in Korean language published only in North Korea, but I doubt if the text is truly credible. Topic is fascinating. One can write 4 or 5 books at least.
Oh yeah, thanks for that input, Dominic. There's a couple people in Korea right now that I do want to get in touch with and ask about Russian sources. I do not read Russian, so obviously they have to be translated into either English or Korean, maybe Japanese, for me to access them. I would like to get some materials that reveal what the Soviet military was and their advisors were pushing in North Korea. The sense I have from my understanding of that period in other areas, though, referring to, say, like the Suzy Kim's book, is that they were a little more hands-off compared to the Americans and kind of giving the reins a little bit more to North Koreans, although, as you point out, Dominic, maybe North Korean sources tend to make it look that way more than it is. Like, of course they're going to. And I'm guessing that's what you're referring to by, like, the credibility of the sources. Like, North Korean sources are great for understanding how they view a topic and what they think of themselves. But as far as who exactly did what in the history, if it says the North Koreans did everything, like, probably not. So yeah, that could be a barrier to my own work, because I would have to make sure, if it is translated, that it's not entirely coming from North Korean, like, official propagandistic accounts of what happened. So I think that was all there was to it. So, but yeah, I'll definitely see what I can. What I have right now in abundance is textbooks. From some of them go back to that period, but mostly later, so it's not quite indicative. but it's quite interesting. But again, there are documents out there. I just need to consult with some colleagues and then make a trip to the archives and get what I can.
So we have about 2 or 3 minutes left before I close up question and answer session. So I guess we can at least collect 1 or 2 more questions before we end this session. So while you guys are still thinking, I have a very interesting kind of reading of one of the source that, a primary source that you showed us in today's talk about this, the first occasion of using the word chonggyo, shukyo in Korean source, the Hansong Sunbo newspaper article, right? That which was published in 1883. And when I was reading it, I found it very interesting the way that how chonggyo was introduced to the audience. I remember reading the word 전쟁, so war, and war happens with the difference between those religions. Different religion is the kind of factor of war. So kind of bringing the idea of religion as a source of violence or a source of conflict, which is, I would say, a very Eurocentric kind of idea based on Europe's own kind of experience, having religion as a kind of very contentious issue that brought war into Europe, like the 30 Years of War, fight between the Catholic and Protestants, which was not the case in East Asia, right? Religion did existed, but it was not a kind of source of conflict. Although there are exceptions, but we don't see kind of the war between Confucians and Buddhism in Joseon Dynasty or Goryeo Dynasty. So that was not the case. And somehow, based on those kind of historical differences, the way that how religion was introduced, in my sense, was in a very negative way. That something that is nothing beneficial but harmful for keeping the integrity or the stability or peace in the society, just by looking into that newspaper article. So I think this also connects to what Jin Young was saying, that religion is a kind of a national thing that kind of defines these people with these kind of labels and kind of in a kind of dogmatic way, non-conforming way, giving no kind of chances or room for flexibility or kind of syncretism with other groups or etc. So I think, yeah, those kind of their historical differences are very well kind of captured in that particular way how the Hansong Sunbo introduced the word chonggyo to the Korean audience.
Did you just like read that off of the screen that I had it up, or like?
I think I saw it before. I saw it
Okay.
before, and this was the second time I was reading it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, there's a series of articles that appear in the Hansong Sunbo that year that talk about religion. Actually, some people will reference, say it was one about a month earlier. That's the first appearance of religion. And actually, that pairing of characters doesn't show up there. They kind of reference it in a different way. So I use the second one in the series. The series, though, seems to be, yeah, it's talking about religion in like the context of other cultures in the world. So yeah, you might maybe the initial usage is thinking about it in like something foreign, something different than what they have in East Asia. Because like you're right, like David Kong wrote this article about like why was there no religious war in pre-modern East Asia? And because like the thing is like you couldn't really have like a war between the Buddhists and the Confucians because they were the same people. like it wasn't like, oh, I'm Buddhist, so I can't be Confucian, or I can't be Taoist, or I can't be like, that's not a thing. Really. There's of course there's fighting between them, and there's exceptions. There's people claiming to be Maitreya and espousing a revolution, and of course you have like the what was that called? Like the Taiping Rebellion, although that was Christianity. So yeah, the kind of religious war we see, that kind of like this understanding of religion, I think when just like in Japan, when the terms are first coined, it's like what is this concept that these Europeans are talking about? We don't have a word for that, and we need to make one up for it. And of course, when you do that, your initial thought is if we borrow or create a word for something from a foreign culture, it's a foreign thing. And of course, it ends up getting more complicated than that, and especially because Japan embraces this concept in their own way. Other foreigners come in. Korea has to deal with the fact very quickly that French, Americans, etc., say like, "Hey, I need my freedom of religion while I'm here in your country," and Koreans are becoming Christian, so they're having to deal with this. Then they have to deal with things like donghak as well, which starts to fall into this category. Yeah, I would I'll love to be able to explore further into the entire intellectual development of the category religion. Uh, but as I'm sure you know, when you're doing a dissertation, the first thing you get told is like, narrow this down to something actually achievable. So I was like, I'm gonna focus on like the role of the government in shaping, and then the kind of the reactive or a contributing discourse to that. The other limiting factor here is that my ability to read literary Chinese is extremely limited. So I can only go back about as far as I'm going back before I wouldn't say I'm unable to read the sources, but become less confident in what I'm reading. uh, I am not like able to read that so easily like you can. I can spot out little phrases and connections and terms, but I'm not confident enough that oh, this is exactly what that says. I can just get the basic gist. So, yeah, maybe in the future, I'll expand out to some other aspect of how religion is seen. What's interesting though, in the North Korean textbooks, more recent than this period, so this is going up through mostly the latter half of the 20th century, you do see these kinds of depictions of religion as contributing to war, but more so this general Marxist understanding of religion that it's a tool of the bourgeois to oppress and divide the proletariat. It's the way to divide and conquer the people. There's a word that came up, a completely weird Korean word that I can't remember what it is now, and I had to learn a new English word to make sense of it. And it's a communist term called obscurantism. So they say religion is a form of obscurantism. It's something that sort of obscures the mind and the intellect, the thoughts, and it distracts you. Essentially, this idea that religion is just something that there's a Marxist communist idea. Religion is something that distracts you from the material, concerns of this world with otherworldly promises of salvation. I see 6 is a Michel Foucault called Jupiter an obscurantist terrorist. Yeah, so it's even a pre-Marxist word.
Great. Yeah. Well, thanks again, John. And let's give another big round of applause for John. Thank you so much for sharing your work and giving us this wonderful opportunity to learn about the topic that you've been working on for your dissertation. And I would also like to thank every participant in today's Zoom meeting, sharing meaningful feedbacks and questions. And again, we are seeking for next presenters for the upcoming series. So if you're interested please let us know, reach out to us. You can find opportunity to also present your work in the next academic year. So that'll be the end of our formal program. But the Zoom will remain open for another 10 or 15 minutes for those who wish to continue to have informal chat with John Grisafi and networking. You can stay in this room. So again, thank you so much for everyone for participating. And today's meeting is now over. Thank you very much.